it's dangerous introducing somebody who doesn't want to be introduced. And almost anything I say, I'll end up paying for later. But let me just say one simple thing to start. And the only way to do it is to quote the Minchas Asher. So the Gemara in Sukkah Chav Ches Amud Aleph talks about the Shmonim Talmidim Shahilu LeHillel HaZaken. And the Gemara talks about all their greatness. And in the end, the Gemara says, Amru alav al Yonasan ben Uziel, Bishar sheyoshe va'osek b'Torah, kol ov sheporeach alav miyad nisraf. Any bird that flew over his head was incinerated. And the Minchas Asher asked, wait, if that's the Maila of the greatest Talmud, then what was the Maila of Hillel the Rebbe? And he answered that the Maila of Hillel the Rebbe was that when Hillel learned Torah, birds were not incinerated, because Hillel's Torah was warm and inspiring and uplifting and unifying. And Ru'uyim Hadvarim Lemisha Amaram, what the Rosh Yeshiva said about Hillel HaZaken is true many, many times about the Rosh Yeshiva. His Torah is uplifting and inspiring and warm and inviting. And there was a time where people used to go to Shiurim live, and I used to go to Ramot, and you see Litvisha and Chardal and Dati Le'umi and Hasidim and people in Madim. It's one of the last places in Israel where everybody gets together to learn Torah together, and it's the Rosh Yeshiva who brings them all together. And particularly in a time of tragedy for our community, for the world, the Rosh Yeshiva stood for what I think is common sense and following the rules and following medical advice, and sometimes at a certain personal expense. He stood up for what he thinks is right. And, you know, it's been a zchus for me and my family that the Rosh Yeshiva has been part of our lives for many years. It's a zchus for our yeshiva. It's a zchus for all of us. And having wasted enough of your time, B'kavod Gadol, Harav Agana, Rav Asher Weiss.
So once again, it's a pleasure to be together with you. And in this strange period, it's almost a year since I haven't been giving shiurim in public, in Rabim. And I miss it, but in these difficult days, we need to take advantage of every venue and every means to disseminate Torah, to teach Torah. So we are together in a way. We see each other, we listen to each other, and let us all hope that B'Korev, this will be over, and we will once again be able to teach Torah and to learn to Torah, as we've been doing since this week's Parsha, Ma'amad Har Sinai, Talmud Torah D'Rabim in its classical sense, in its normal way. People are coming together to learn Torah together. For the time being, this is the best we can do. So once again, it's a simcha, it's a privilege to see all of you and to be able to learn Torah together. This week we read Parshas Yisro, which is Ma'amad Har Sinai and Kabbalas HaTorah. This past Shabbos, Parshas B'Shalach, ends with Parshas Amalek, Timche Zecher Amalek Metachas HaShomayim. And usually we assume that there is a connection, there's a kesher between one parsha and the other, between the end of one parsha and the beginning of another. Timcha Zecher Amalek Metachas HaShomayim. And when a Kodesh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to fight Amalek, Moshe calls Yeshua. And he tells Yeshua, Tzei Elochem Ba'amalek. And the Zohar asks, what a fundamental question. Moshe Rabbeinu was aware how important Malchemes Amalek is. Ein Shmoi Sholem, ve'ein Kisoi Sholem, Adshe Timcha Zecher Amalek. So why does Moshe send Yehoshua? And why doesn't Moshe stand and spearhead this effort? Mitzvah bo yosem b'shluchim. The Zohar explains there are two different Amaleks, Amalek de la Elo and Amalek de la Tato. Amalek is not only a people, not only an army, not only a nation. Amalek is an idea, it's a concept, it's the abstract Amalek, which is the Shoresh Hatuma. And Moshe says, I will fight Amalek de La'ela up in the heavens, and you fight Amalek down here. And when Moshe lifts his hands to the heavens, V'gova Yisrael, Kashi Yaniach Moshe Yodov, V'gova Amalek. We cannot overcome Amalek de Latata unless we overcome Amalek de La'ela. So Yehoshua commands the army, and they fight Amalek de Latata. Moshe is the one, and obviously the only one, that knows how to deal and how to combat Amalek de La'ela. How could we understand how and why was it Moshe that needed to fight Amalek de La'ela? Many years ago, many decades ago, maybe the first time I went through Bava Basra, maybe it wasn't the first time, I cannot recall. But many, many years ago, when I came across the Gemara in Bava Basra and Memvav, I was taken aback and shocked. So in Bava Basra and Memvav, we find Amalek Siman. In Shas Bavli, we are familiar with Simonim. And sometimes Chazal put together strange words and letters just as a siman. So in Bava Basra Memvav, Amalek Siman. And this is a big surprise. This is a name we want to erase, we want to destroy. So Chazal found no other siman but Amalek. Nobody will dare to erase him from Shas Bavli. Why does he deserve this huge kavod? I looked around and I found Rabbi Yankov Emden in his Agois on Shas asked this very same question. And so typical of Rabbi Yankov Emden, he uses harsh language. And I would prefer Rabbi Yankov Emden use this language against Amalek rather than against the Yonasan Eibeshitz. So Rabbi Yankov Emden writes, Kach ya'oseh lemenuval hazeh, lemshoch oto lebeis hamedrash, leshabor et kocho, ולהוציא ממנו כל ניצוץ kadosh. This is the way we fight Amalek. A wise strategist chooses the theater of combat and tries to lure the enemy into a fight on terrain that is advantageous to him, to his army. We cannot overcome Amalek in the theaters, in the movie houses, in the sports stadiums, nowhere. He is stronger than we are anywhere else. In Bava Basra Memvav, we could overcome Amalek. So Rabbi Yankov Emden says we need to entice him, to bring him, to lure him into the Beis Medrash. Kach ya'oseh lemenuval hazeh. לגרור אותו לבייס המדרש, להוציא ממנו כל ניצוץ קדוש. And that is why Moshe Rabbeinu is the one to fight Amalek de La'ela. And the only way we could overcome the abstract Amalek is in Bava Basra, or in Bava Kama, or in Bava Metzia, or in Zevachim, or in Baruch, or wherever it is. So we are less than 30 days before Purim. And in Megillat Avtes Vav, the Gemara explains the posuk right at the end of Megillat Esther, Mordechai HaYehudi, Ratzui l'roiv echov. Most of the people loved Mordechai, and he was broadly accepted by the majority. And the Gemara asks, and who was in the minority? Who could question the greatness of Mordechai? He salvaged Klal Yisrael. He saved the entire people. His greatness was, how could it be questioned? So who were the ones that were not Mordechai's Hasidim? Who were the Misnagdim? And the Gemara explains, Miktsas HaSanhedrin. There were some of the Chachamim that were unhappy with Mordechai. And why is that? Because he was Mavatal Torah. Mordechai was a Rosh Koilel. He was a teacher of Torah, and he became an Askin. And I don't understand. But wasn't it obvious that he needed to rise to the challenge, which he did? My feeling is, some of the Chachamim said, Mordechai, Haman is Mezera Amalek. This is, in a way, Melchemes Amalek. How do you expect to overcome Amalek with Bittul Torah? It just won't work. It just won't work. If this would be any other war, Oisig v'mitzvah potem and a mitzvah. Yes, but this is Amalek. Will this succeed? Is it possible to fight and overcome Amalek with Bittul Torah? That was their argument. Obviously, Mordechai was right, but I could appreciate what the others thought. So in Megillah Daf Gimel, we go all the way back to Kiddush Eretz Yisrael al Yedei Yoshua ben Nun. And the Gemara says, Yeshua, by night, takes a stroll, probably trying just to get some fresh air out his head. And suddenly he sees a warrior. He doesn't recognize him. And obviously he's not familiar with his uniform. So Yeshua turns to that officer. He was dressed up as an officer, and he asks him, Halonu atim litzorenu. Do you belong to our army, or are you friend or foe? Who are you? And that officer responds and he says, I am neither friend or foe. I'm not a mortal. Saratzavu Hashem unoichi. I'm an angel, and I was sent from above with a message to you. And Yeshua asks, and what is that message? Emesh bitaltem tomed shel bein ha'arbaim, v'ayom bitaltem en ha'Torah. And Yeshua asks, Aleizem hen bosu. So which of the two transgressions am I reprimanded? What is it about? Al ato basi. Bittul Torah. And I once again ask, it's a Gemara Mefareshes in Soita Mem Daled, B'malches mitzvah, oisig mitzvah potem and a mitzvah, and we're potter from Talmud Torah. If I would be Yehoshua, I would quote to the Malach, did you forget a Gemara in Soita? Don't you see? We're in the midst of war. So what is the problem with Bittul Torah? So I think the Malach said, Yeshua, you don't get it. I have not come to demand El Boino Shel Torah. No. If I would be sent by a Kodesh Baruch Hu to demand El Boino Shel Torah, I would be either dressed up with a kapota and a streimel, or with a Hamburg and a frock, like a Rosh Yeshiva, like a Rebbe. Look at me. I'm dressed up as an officer. Because lo et elbona shel Torah bati lidrosh, ela elbona shel milchama. This is Melchemes Amalek. And how do you expect to win with Bittul Torah? It's not about mitzvahs Talmud Torah. It's about being victorious in this battle. And that is why I was sent to you with full military gear, be'ephod maleh. How does Yeshua respond? Vayolem b'toich ha'emek, malamid shalan bo'umka shel halacha. He doesn't put up a chevres tehillim. rather a koil alev. So yes, the end of Parshas B'Shalach is Melchemes Amalek, and it is closely associated with Kabbalah Satira. This is a difficult period for all of us, for Klal Yisrael, for the Torah world. Painful, tragic, and difficult in many different ways. And my dear friend and Talmud, Rav Eli, told me that for all these months, the yeshiva was saved from COVID until recently, when many, many Talmidim came down with the disease. I hope you're all feeling fine, and I hope you're out of the woods, or at least on your way out of the woods. And what I said many times during this pandemic, Af chochmosi amduli, Chazal say Torah shalamadet li ba'af. Lefum tzara agra. And we are tested every day by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Every day in different ways. This is our challenge. How do we respond to COVID? How do we keep Kol Torah? How do we keep the fire burning, this flame alive in such a difficult period? And I think you've done well. And my bracha to all of you, Rabbanan v'Talmidei, keep it up. And miyameim shel aviseinu lo posku yeshiva mehem, yordu leMitzrayim yeshiva imohem. Even in the most difficult days, in the most tragic days. In the Warsaw Uprising, when the last Jews were being killed and murdered, and the buildings were going up in flames, Rav Moshe Prager wrote a book about the Gera Hasidim, the young Bukhara that were learning in the basements, like Posik Puma Migirsa. Some of them used arms to fight and to kill our enemies, and the others were learning Torah. And that is the combination that kept us going throughout all these years. And Kodesh Baruch Hu should be with us and with all of you. And the yeshiva should keep up this Avodas HaKodesh, this holy endeavor. And learning Torah in these difficult times is a challenge, and it's a tremendous chus. So thank you for giving me this opportunity tonight to try to give you some words of chizuk and inspiration. And I was asked by Rabbi Weber to take some questions, which I happily will.
Okay. First of all, I mentioned Rosh Hashiva before. Moshe Prager is my relative. He used to stay at
Really?
our house for Shabbos. Yes, but okay, we'll leave that aside for now. Start with an easy question, I hope. Tefillin. Simon Chaf Bet of Minchas Asher and Sefer Shmos. The Rosh Hashiva has a fascinating approach to the Hagdara of the mitzvah of Tefillin, comparing it mostly to Talmud Torah, and saying that when the Rambam doesn't say it's mitzvah b'chol yom, that the idea behind tefillin is to wear tefillin as much as we can. And yet, we don't. It's starting to become more popular in certain circles, but for the most part, we wear tefillin only at Shachris. So, the Rosh Hashiva is muted.
I apologize.
Rosh Hashiva's internet went out for a minute of the question, so ask it again.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
I just apologize a moment because I forgot to turn off the phones and they're ringing. So just one moment. Yes. So I heard the beginning of the question regarding tefillin.
Right. So the Rosh Hashiva's approach is that the more you wear tefillin, the better it is. And yet, Lamaisa, we don't see people wearing tefillin all day long while they're learning during mincha. What's the approach to tefillin, and how does our approach reflect the Rosh Hashiva's approach?
Let me say this: it is notable that I wrote this chiddush in Minchas Osha al Torah. I think it's a Parshas Bo, and it was first published in Minchas Osha Masechet Psachim. It's not on my chuvas, and I based this analysis and opinion on the Rambam and in Tosfos. It's not necessarily halacha lamaisa, and I did quote the Kesef Mishnah, the Prima Godim, the Bir Halacha in Sem Melamed Zayin that do maintain that tefillah does depend on every day. And, I can't get into a very lengthy discussion, but one of the Yesodis, one of the fundamental Chiddushim I came up with in recent years was, and I'm trying to explain this very briefly, all the mitzvahs that are essentially, in essence, avodah sukel, all the mitzvahs that are not about the result, the outcome, but rather avodah selukim that is essentially in the act, are either mitzvahs of Shabbos and Moed or mitzvahs of Seder Hayom. And that is how the Rambam knows that Chayav Odom L'Spalal B'Kol Yom. The Kesef Mishnah and the Lechem Mishnah in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah are very unreasonable. So my approach is every mitzvah that is essentially Avodah Sukkah, if it is not associated with Shabbos and Yom Tov, it is part of the Jewish routine of Seder Hayom. I still argue, well, the Rambam does write in Hilchos Tefillah B'Kol Yom. He doesn't say by Tefillin B'Kol Yom. So I still insist that according to the Rambam, Tefillah is not associated with a day. But La Halacha, I don't know. But generally speaking, I attach extreme importance to minhag. And many times in my chuvas, I use the expression, Loi chazinan l'rabonen kshishoi. I didn't see my great Rabbeim or Gedolim of the previous generation wearing tefillin all day. Neither did the Kloisenberger Rebbe, nor did the Moshe Feinstein. And I knew many Gedolim. None of them wore tefillin all day. So I follow in the footsteps of giants. And I know that in some circles it's become very popular to wear tefillin all day. I personally am not excited about it. And to me, minhag has extreme importance. And many times I say, sometimes we need to be choishish, maybe the Minchas Osha isn't right. It's not reasonable, but it's possible. So sometimes we would question, maybe the Minchas Osha isn't right.
I would question that about the last statement, but okay.
Okay, I appreciate
it. Okay. Next question. The Rosh Hashiva's written hundreds of tshuvas on Corona, related to Corona, about the period we're in. Someone asked the following question. Does the Rosh Hashiva have a sense for 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? What's the tshuva of the Minchas Osha related to Corona that will be quoted? What's the one that will stand on its own?
I hope 158 of the tshuvas will be quoted. That's the present number. The Sefer is mamish going into print, I hope. When Minchas Osha and Corona, I very much hope by the time it comes out will not be nogea alocha lamaisa, one drop. I very much hope that it'll be a fascinating limud, and I think Lamdonim will learn it. Historians will. The one that probably should be quoted more than the others are the ones dealing with the concept of pikuach nefesh, because most of the tshuvas counting by numbers are associated with Yomim Tovim, with Hilchos Tefillah, but the ones that are most significant are the ones dealing with the definition of Pikuach Nefesh, the definition of Mageifa, and the importance of Pikuach Nefesh. And to my dismay, this is very disturbing, and I always try to formulate my words in a respectful manner. I still think that not everybody understands that Pikuach Nefesh overrides every other concern. So I think and I hope that the ones that will be most quoted in years to come will be the tshuvas dealing essentially with Pikuach Nefesh. It's a minority of the Simonim in the Sefer, because counting by numbers, most of the tshuvas deal with Tefillah, with Yomim Tovim, and with Avelis and many other areas, but I think that the most significant ones are the ones dealing with the concept of Pikuach Nefesh.
Okay. A question about Chumros. Just to take an extreme position, the Mesilas Yesharim in Parak Yudalet says, "Uprishus bedinim hu lahachmir bahem tamid lachush afilu ledivrei yachid b'machlokes im ta'am onira afilu she'ein halacha kemoso." I assume that the Minchas Asher doesn't write shuvos for Prushim, because otherwise the answer would always be a chumrah. So the question is there a framework for approach for when chumras are appropriate, when chumras are less appropriate?
The entire Mesilas Yesharim is the blueprint for Hasidim that want to come ultimately to the highest level of Dveikus and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think that is the context of what you just read. So to me as a Pesach writing Tshuvas for Klal Yisrael, that doesn't apply. Many times I make it clear in my Tshuvas that when Chazal say Koiche de Hetera Odiv, it's not the same as the concept of Gzeir Shein Ravet Sibi Yachoy Lamed Boy. Koiche de Hetera Odiv is the essence of halacha. It is the tafkid of Poskim. So the Minchas, so the Mesilas Yesharim is referring to the individual that is noeg b'minik Chasidus, and the way he defines one of the yesodis of Prishus is Kadesh Atzmachu b'mutalacha. So Kadesh Atzma b'mutalacha is in various different spheres. One of them is Chumras. But even so, I would not take this line literally to be machmi liyochid b'mokim rabim, not always. We won't be machmir kebeishami against Beis Hillel, or Abaye against Rava, or a Shlokish against Rabbi Yochanan. When Chazal have a clear verdict what the halacha is, that is no longer yochid keneged rabim. And even when we go down in the generations with the Shainim and Poskim, not always is it midas chasidus to be machmi yochid keneged rabim, but many times, yes. That is the entire concept of glat when we deal with echsherim. Glat means loy ochel b'boser shahoira b'chochem, which is above and beyond the call of halacha. So that is the very first source that, yes, Chassidus sometimes demands going beyond the call of halacha. So I think that is the way we need to understand the Mesilas Yesharim. It is not one of the fundamentals in Hayroah, in halacha koiche de hetera adif. And even in Midas Chassidus, we need to apply this with wisdom, with caution, and with a profound understanding of halachic fundamentals.
Okay. A completely different type of question. When did the Rosh Yeshiva know that he wanted to be a Rosh Yeshiva?
I can't recall. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a Rosh Yeshiva. It was 1 year after my wedding that my great Rebbe, the Kloisenberg Rebbe, called me in and he told me he wants me to be a Magachir in the yeshiva. And I was totally surprised, and I said, I'm sitting in Koil, I'm 21 years old. And he told me, you're not made for Koil. You need to teach Torah. And he had a very unique language. He told me, if any of you talk Yiddish, Eli, I think you speak Yiddish, right?
I'm not going to get it, but I'll try.
So his language, he said, "Die bist nicht für Koilel gemacht." You're not made for Koilel. You need to teach Torah. And I was younger than 22. I was 21, and my Talmidim were 19, 20. There was a year between me and them, and I think I was good at it. And so that's when my Rosh Yeshiva career started. I always thought that I have something to offer, and I always believed I will teach Torah, but in what capacity, I had no idea. I didn't plan this. So Baruch Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch was good to me. So I don't know, for some reason you call me Rosh Yeshiva, many others call me Darav. So, I have various different functions and titles, and I'm happy with all of them. So from a very young age, I thought and believed that I will teach Torah. So the story probably will someday begin at my bar mitzvah. So Shabbos before my bar mitzvah, my father was already in Eretz Yisrael. And I was Shabbos Ofruf, Aliyah LaTorah in America, in Borough Park. And we left Sunday to Eretz Yisrael, and my bar mitzvah was Wednesday night. So Shabbos, I needed to prepare my drasha without my father's help. And even though it was a Hasidic shtetl, for some reason they didn't sing. And they let me finish the entire drasha. And a person approached me after the drasha, and he kissed me, and he said this: your brothers are all going to be great Talmid Chacham, but you're going to be a Rosh Yeshiva. Was that prophecy? I don't know. But I remember that. So he gave me a kiss on my forehead, and he said, my older brothers were already in yeshiva. They were learning. They were stars. So he said, they're all going to be Talmidei Chacham, but you're going to be a Rosh Yeshiva. So, Baruch Hashem, B'siyata D'Shmaya, it just came to be.
Okay. I got a number of questions about lab-grown meat, but I want to turn it into something different. First of all, obviously the Rosh Yeshiva could talk about the status of lab-grown meat. But I was wondering, what does the Rosh Yeshiva do? Is there really such a thing as a question of first impression, where there is no Gemara to call on? There are no poskim who ever discussed this before, and you have to sit down in front of a blank piece of paper and write a tshuva on lab-grown meat? Or is there always a starting point someplace?
So let me say this. There's an expression, Shalas Chochem Chotzi Tshuva. It's nowhere to be found in Chazal. And to the best of my recollection, the source of this expression is in Tshuvas Maram Al Shakar. And you ask very smart questions. So first impression, Shalas Tshuvas Chavetzeles HaShoroim. He was the Rav in Tarnopol, a member of the great Ba'abad family that were for a few decades were Rabbanim in Tarnopol. And he writes that he heard from the Derech HaMelech, who was Rabberish Rappaport, one of the Gedolim in Galicia. He was the Rav in Rava. He wrote a sefer on the Rambam. That when a Rav gets a shaila, he needs to develop a feeling and then try to substantiate his Ashkofa Rishoina. To me, That sounds totally unreasonable. I think he needs to try to ignore his Hashkafa Rishayna and just try to get into the sugya. When you have Hashkafa Rishayna, you have a fundamental feeling, and you try to justify that feeling, you can go wrong. You need to try to ignore your fundamental feeling. Or how did you describe it, Eli? How did you phrase your question?
A question of a first impression?
Yeah. So don't try to justify your first impression. But I must say that whether you try or not, it is obviously part of human nature and the thought process. When you hear a shaila, you do have a first impression. And you do have a fundamental feeling what the answer should be. I do not think you need to try to follow that feeling. No, you need to try to ignore it. But to me, usually, the maskana justifies and coincides with my basic hargasha. Not always, but usually. We need to try to develop tshuvas based on earlier sources, but not always do we have earlier sources. So in the tshuvas I wrote about lab meat, and I did write some tshuvas which I could make available to you and to all the Talmidim, because there's an institute in Israel who is in the forefront, I think, cutting edge of this technology, is an Israeli company, and the firm people. And I have a kesher with them, and I wrote several tshuvas on this. I did bring sources, but the sources cannot be described as rayas, because, it's just dimui milta la milta. And many times I say our generation needs gedolim of the caliber of the Ramban and the Rashba, because we are confronted with so many different shaylas. Shalosh sharum avoteinu. This new world of science and technology is bringing forth questions, and sometimes we really don't find any sources, and we need to apply svara. So I wouldn't describe it as a first impression. I would describe it as a well thought out and deeply analyzed tshuva, but not always do we have clear proof or rayas, and sometimes it is based on the feeling of a posek and ultimately trying to compare the sources we have and the questions that we're dealing with. I hope I made myself clear.
You want to just tell people in a sentence what the Rosh Hashiva's psak was?
Yeah, my psak is, if it's meat, no matter how it came to be. It's not like artificial, meat menat someach. If it has the fiber, if in a chemical examination in a lab, it will have the fiber and the essence of meat, then it's meat, whether it was produced from stem cells or born, or developed in the womb of an animal. Meat is meat. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then obviously it's a duck. That's just a saying, a proverb. But meat is meat, and it depends on what it is and not how it came to be.
I think that should go into a tshuva.
The story with the duck?
Yeah, I think so.
No, that's Torah Shebal Peh. That won't be in the tshuva.
Okay. A follow-up question in terms of psak. Does a posek only paskin the question he was asked, or does he look at the world and see where it might go? Example, self-driving cars. So on the one end, self-driving cars on Shabbos. So on the one end, I could see a theory where a posek says, well, if we're matir this, where's Shabbos going to go? What will happen to Shabbos? On the other hand, it dawned on me that self-driving cars may save tons of chilul Shabbos for chilonim. Are those values that a posek can call on, is just answer the question?
I think a posik definitely needs to bear in mind what will the consequences of his response be. And you touched upon a very fundamental question in the philosophy of halacha, or in the hashkafa of halacha. So there are two different approaches between poskim. One philosophy would say, if the result of your tshuva would impact negatively on the Jewish world, then you need to reach a different conclusion. I feel that we need to say, even judging by clear halachic parameters, this might be permissible, but we exercise our authority and say this should be osar, and we cannot permit this and let it be. So you're running a danger that others would say, okay, he said that by halakha it's permissible. But on the other hand, we cannot distort halakha and try to convince people in what we don't believe. I hope I'm making myself clear, because this is a very, very sensitive issue. So on one hand, I think a person definitely needs to bear in mind what will the result of this psak be and where it'll go. Will it cause more Chilul Shabbos? Will it cause barriers tumbling down? So I do think we bear responsibility on the effect and the consequences of our tshuvas. But then the question would be, so will we try to distort the result of our tshuva and run the risk that some people might say, no, what you say doesn't make sense. I think we need to uphold the purity and the emes of halacha. And if we think the consequences will be unreasonable, on one hand, maybe don't write the tshuva. That was the approach of the Divrei Chaim in the controversy about machine matzahs. So 150 years ago in Europe, there was a huge controversy about machine matzahs. Some Gedolim wrote tshuvas prohibiting machine matzahs, and the others said, no, your tshuvas don't make sense. And they disputed all the rationale of prohibiting machine matzahs. So the Shoel HaMeishiv, who was the greatest posek of that generation, was Mati Reb Shlomo Kluger answered. The Divrei Chaim said, in this issue, I have a Kabbalah from my great father-in-law, who was the Baruch Tam, that sometimes you don't go into halachic analysis and you say, this is unacceptable. That was the approach of the Divrei Chaim. So when you ask the question and you think giving a heter might have extremely negative consequences, for instance, regarding Shabbos in some different areas, autonomous cars is a good example, then either you would say, this is something that I don't agree with, it's osur, without going into halachic analysis, or you would say, by clear halachic definition, we don't see a reason to asur, but we think this is something that we, as from Jews, should not accept. But don't try to convince and fabricate the Isser when it's not convincing, because that is going against emes, which is the foundation of Torah, and it is the seal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chasomei of HaKadosh Baruch Hu emes. So I discussed three different options when we are afraid of the consequences that a psak, a heter, might cause. One would be totally avoiding getting into a halachic discussion, like the Divrei Chaim's approach was 150 years ago. The other would be, even though maybe by clear halachic criteria would be mutter, we think this should be set aside and prohibited. And then people will question your authority. Okay? if they want to question our authority, they'll do so. You can't prevent them, but we will say this should not be accepted. The other approach, which to me isn't reasonable, is trying to fabricate an issur, even though it's not really what you feel by clear halachic discussion. So I hope, this is a complicated question you put on my table, and I did my best to explain my opinion.
Okay, maybe this will be easier. One of the, I think one of the...
Agav, regarding autonomous cars, I also have a few interesting tshuvas dealing not necessarily with Shabbos, but with other pikuach nefesh questions, which are a totally different discussion. We'll discuss it some other time.
No, they're fascinating questions. Okay, in the Dati Leumi world, Gemara, quantity-wise, of course, outweighs everything else in our yeshiva, but there's a value in learning Tanakh, and it's part of the curriculum, and people, it's not unusual to see somebody learning Tanakh in the Beis Medrash. My sense is that in the more Haredi world, that's not the case. I was wondering...
I recently wrote a tshuva about this, actually, which once again I'll make available to you. Yes, so the Messiahs in the yeshiva world is not to put much emphasis on Tanakh. But I heard many, many times from my Rebbe, from the Kleiser Maggid Rebbe, he was very unhappy about the fact that so many Talmidei Chacham are not familiar in Tanakh. So in Volozhin, the Netziv, following Rebbe Tzela Volozhiner, following Reb Chaim Volozhin, they had every day a shir in Chumash, in Rashi. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner quotes the Gra that a person needs to be thoroughly versed in all Chav Dalet Sifrei Torah Nevi'im V'Ksuvim. So in our schools, it's not really a central part of the curriculum. And we already find that in Droshes Chasam Sofer. Some argue that is the Gemara in Brachas Chavches, Minu B'neichem Min HaHigoyin. So there are two different pshatim in Rashi. In Brachas Chavches, what does that mean? One of the two paroshim in Rashi is Torah Shebechsav. So those that do not encourage learning Tanakh base their argument on that Gemara. There are two different pshatim in Rashi, Minu B'neichem and HaHigoyin. I definitely think it's part of the shleimus of a Talmid Chacham to be Boki and Kol Torah, which includes Sifrei Nevi'im V'Ksuvim. So Tosfos in Bava Basa Kuf Yud Gimel says, Lefa'amim loy hoyu b'kiyim b'psukim, that sometimes the Amiroim were in Boki and Psukim. And some of the Achronim are taken aback. The Chidah, in a few different sources, writes, Chas v'sholem, to say that the Amiroim were in Boki b'psukim. And I ask, so from the Tosfos till the Chidah was about 700 years. Nobody was angry with Tosfos for 700 years. The Ramban and the Rashba, the Ritva and the Ran, nobody had anything to say about Tosfos. They saw the Tosfos, so why didn't they say anything? It's not only Tosfos. Tosfos Arash, Bava Kama Nun Hey, says the same as Tosfos in Bava Basa Kuf Yud Gimel. So obviously, according to Tosfos, the great Amiroim spent most of their time analyzing the Mishnah and less time in Tanakh. If Tosfos says, Pa'omim lo hayu b'kiyim b'psukim, and there are a few Gemaras, Bava Kama Nun Hey, Bava Basra Daf Tes, Avodah Zorah Daf Daled. So in my tshuva, I quoted various different Gemaras. So this is an interesting discussion. And my fundamental argument is a very simple one. Devorim shebechsav iya Torah shayla amran ba'al peh. So they couldn't do much chazering of Tanakh. On the other hand, so they had a huge job to memorize Shisha Sidra Mishnah, the entirety of Shas. On the other hand, they couldn't learn Psukim only when they sat with the Sefer Torah. That was before the printing press. So it shouldn't be B'chlal HaChiddush that Lefa'omim Lo Hayu B'kiyim B'Psukim. And their limit was primarily in memorizing the huge ocean of literature, which is the Shas and all the Piskei Halacha. So it is the Messiahs in the yeshiva world not to put great emphasis on Tanakh, but it definitely is part of the shleimus of the Talmud Chacham. And I definitely would encourage yeshiva boys to spend some time in learning Navi, because the Nevi'im are so fundamental, to all Chazal and Sifrei Musar and Divrei Teichocha. And so I definitely would encourage Talmidim to spend some time to cover the entire Torah Nevi'im and Ksuvim.
How are we doing for time?
We still have some time. It's okay.
Okay. We're living through a difficult time, obviously, and without being personal, I know that the Rosh Yeshivas lived through tragedies recently. Could the Rosh Yeshiva share with us, if he's willing, what he calls on in down times, Mamori Chazal, particular Sfarim that in difficult moments help him?
Tehillim, more than anything else. I cannot call on specifics for him. The Minchas Osher Amunah V'Betochen, I think, is an inspiring sefer. I know him very well and I'm familiar with the sefer. I think it's very good. But more than anything else, just feeling the closeness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I said many times, Eli, as you know, you're like family. You're like a family member. And my wife passed away, it's 2.5 years ago, somewhat more than 2.5 years ago. And many times I said that the last Shabbos I spent with some of my daughters in Sloan Kettering was probably the time I felt closest to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in difficult times, in tragic times, I think sometimes if you're really a Baal Amun and a Baal B'toch and you feel a close, Kodesh Baruch was together with you, crying with you, feeling with you. But I think more than anything else, it's just the Tehillim. Nobody's more familiar with tears in David HaMelech than the Tehillim. Oceans of tears were dropped on the Tehillim. And more than anything else, that is what gives us chizuk in times of stress and tragedy and pain. And I think it's very important that we feel the pain of others, especially in these testing and difficult times.
Okay, so the Rosh Yeshiva mentioned the Sefer Emunah U'Bitachon. I know for Rabbi Gottlieb Bizan, he actually teaches that Sefer in our yeshiva. The beginning of that Sefer deals with an issue that somebody asked a question on, but I'll put it in my context because it's easier for me. There's somebody we all know and love in the yeshiva whose father is very, very critically ill. So I got a WhatsApp this afternoon saying, asking to say Tehillim for the person. And 2 minutes later, I got a WhatsApp saying that a Talmud needs medicine. So I said to myself, not understanding any of this, well, instead of saying Tehillim to save this person, I will apply the schar that I would get for going to the pharmacy to get medicine for this person, for the refuah shlema of this person. All concepts and ideas that I don't understand, but I know are a subject discussed in the Sefer Emunah B'Tachon. Could the Rosh Yeshiva help me sort that out? Does it make any sense that I could apply the schar mitzvah to a refuah shlema for somebody? Do I have that kind of power?
I think we do, but this is a mystery we don't really understand. And I discussed this, I don't think in the Sefer Emunah V'Bitochen, but in a lengthy siman I wrote about the concept of Yisocha Zavulun. So Maram Al-Shakar says, Yisocha Zavulun has nothing to do with contracts and with agreements. And he quotes the Posuk, Tzidkas HaTzadik Olov Tihiyeh, Rishas HaRosha Olov Tihiyeh. Is that a Posuk in Yirmiyahu? I don't even recall. Oh, you see my shortcomings right now. We're discussing Navi. Where is this Posuk, Tzidkas HaTzadik Olov Yihiyeh, Rishas HaRosha Olov Yihiyeh? So Maram Al-Shakar says, there is no such a thing you do something for others. You bear the consequences of your deeds, l'tav v'lamuta, whether it's a mitzvah or an aveda. But we do find...
Yechezkel.
Oh, I actually thought it was Yechezkel. I don't know why I said it was Yirmiyahu. So it's the Navi. So, but we do find, we say Kaddish for the deceased, we daven for the deceased, we daven for the Amid. So there are some things that are above and beyond the realm of our understanding. I don't think we need to even try to explain everything, but we do find that one davens for others, he can do mitzvahs for others. So, Eli, first of all, I think you did the right thing beyond, even if you wouldn't dedicate this schar, you did the right thing, because caring for somebody that needs medicine would come before davening. There are many others that davened for that person, and you had the mitzvah of caring for a patient. But I do think that we do perform mitzvahs in the merit of others. It has relevance, and I cannot explain how it works and how it fits in with the posuk in Yechezkel. But in many sources we find, and I think it's more about tefillah. So when a person turns to a Kodesh Baruch Hu and he says, I'm doing a mitzvah, so please answer my prayers. I did something for you, do something for me. So when a person performs a mitzvah, it's not that actually this mitzvah goes to another person. But when he performs a mitzvah, then his tefillah is more apt to be miskabel in the schus of this mitzvah. So when you went to the pharmacy and you said a Kodesh Baruch Hu, I'm not saying Tillim for that chayla, but please, I ask you to send him a refuah shalema in the merit of this mitzvah. It's not that this mitzvah is going to his balance. It's that a Kodesh Baruch Hu would accept your prayer and your feeling, and in the merit of the mitzvah, he will have some added value. That would be my interpretation of the concept.
Okay. The mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah has become very popular recently. When I was a little boy, I didn't know anybody who had a Sefer Torah, who wrote a Sefer Torah, but maybe with affluence, what have you, it's become much more common. Is there a limit? Meaning a shul has 15 Sifrei Torah, 20 Sifrei Torah. Is there a point at which somebody says, there's no need, and either based on the Shitas HaRush, there are better things to do with your money, or to try to focus the question, if somebody comes to the Minchas Asher and says, I have $40,000, I could give it to tzedakah. There's a lot of causes that need my money, but I never wrote a Sefer Torah before.
If a person would ask me, I have $10,000, should I give it for tzedakah or take part in a Sefer Torah? I definitely would say, give it for tzedakah. I'll tell you what my dilemma is with the $40,000, because in my opinion, when you write a ois in a Sefer Torah, you're not makayim the mitzvah of ksiva Sefer Torah. It is only if you have your own Sefer Torah. So when people get together and write a Sefer Torah, they're not really makayim the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. Ksiva Sefer Torah is writing a Sefer Torah or purchasing a Sefer Torah and having your own Sefer Torah. I would still say, if you have $40,000 and you're contemplating, give it for a tzedakah, to support Torah, to support the needy, the desperate. There are so many important causes. Unless a shul really doesn't have a Sefer Torah. But as you said, most shuls today have more than one Sefer Torah. If there's no need, I definitely think he should better utilize those $40,000. So the Achronim already deal with the question, as we very well know, why aren't we makpid in the midst of Ksiva Sefer Torah? The obvious answer is because throughout the ages, very few people could afford a Sefer Torah. And as you mentioned before, this is the age of plenty. This is the age of abundance. But in the past, very few people could afford a Sefer Torah. But I do think that the rush is accepted halacha. So maybe the Ikar mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah today no longer applies to a Sefer Torah, but rather to Sifrei Limud. So if a person would say, I have $10,000, should I participate in a Sefer Torah or give tzedakah? Definitely give tzedakah. I have $40,000 and I could write a Sefer Torah or for myself or give tzedakah. That would be a tougher call. I would still say give tzedakah. So if you're giving a lot of tzedakah and you're rich, and your question is, should I build another room in my summer house? Should I have a private ski slope or write a Sefer Torah? Should I install a swimming pool in my backyard or write a Sefer Torah? Definitely write a Sefer Torah. But if the dilemma is giving tzedakah or writing a Sefer Torah, I would say give tzedakah. One more question, my dear friends.
Okay. Now, this is always when I get the Rosh Hashiva into trouble. So I'll ask a safe one. In America, almost every shul has a Mincha Ma'ariv minyan. Mincha before Shkia, a few Dvar Torah, whatever, and Ma'ariv right after Shkia, which I suppose is not lechatchila. And in Eretz Yisrael, there's no such minhag, maybe because Shkia and Seis are so much closer to each other. Is that something that we should be trying to fix, stopping people from davening Ma'ariv before it Seis? Or is it the kind of thing that, you're going to say Kriya Shema again anyway, you'll say all three parshas again anyway, you'll get out of problems like Zrizin Makdimin, or say a different way. Ma'ariv after Shkia before it says, or Ma'ariv at 10 o'clock, after dinner, after a whole bunch of things where it's more at risk.
I don't think we need to go out of our way to try to fix this. It's Minig Ashkenaz for hundreds of years to daven Ma'ariv before it says Kechavim. I do think that it definitely is preferable to daven Ma'ariv after it says. But knowing many communities in America, if people will go home after Mincha, many of them will not come back to shul to daven Ma'ariv. And many of them will daven B'Yechidus. Not everybody will recite Krishma after it says. I think a minority of the people will. Most people daven the Ma'ariv. Krishma Shalamit is that they say the first pasuk. So that is why I do not think we need to be very active and aggressive in preventing these minyanim. So if a Ben Torah would ask me, I say definitely daven Ma'ariv with a minyan after it says, and not after the Shkia. But knowing many shuls in America, I think if we won't have Mincha Ma'ariv close to one another before the Shkia and after Shkia, many people will not be davening Ma'ariv or minyan. Some of them will not be davening Ma'ariv at all. Maybe most of them won't be saying Gimel Pashias Kriya Shema after it says, and therefore I was never very, very outspoken against this minig. And it is a minig Ashkenaz going way, way back. Okay, it was a pleasure to be with you, and it's my dear friend. It always makes me happy to see you. And we should share beside his Tavis. So if you could daven for my mother, she still needs a refuah for Hadel Bas Leah. She's doing somewhat better, but she still has a long way to go with COVID-19. So I'm sure we have many people on our lists, but if you could daven for my mother, it'll be very appreciated. And we should share beside his Tavis. And keep on the kultite and the yeshiva should just be Maisa B'Hoilech. And we should be Zeicha B'Kora B'Yameinu to Kabbalah Satayr and to be as Mashiach Tzidkenu. Kol Tov.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Amen.
Yes,
Amen.